Exactly 180 seconds remain before the most expensive border wall on the planet is rendered mathematically and physically irrelevant. Beneath the sun-scorched dust of Agua Prieta, a structural ghost is breathing, waiting for a single mechanical trigger to defy gravity. You believe the ground beneath your feet is solid rock, but in reality, it is a hollowed-out labyrinth of calculated engineering. On May 17, 1990, DEA agents entered a ranch house, unaware they were walking on a 300-ton hydraulic secret. They searched for hours, prying up floor tiles and tapping walls, finding nothing but the silence of a well-guarded tomb. One frustrated investigator reached for a simple water spigot, turning the handle as if to quench a deep, burning thirst. Suddenly, the floor began to groan with the sound of grinding gears as hidden hydraulic pistons engaged their massive kinetic force. A heavy slate pool table rose toward the ceiling, revealing a dark, vertical shaft descending into the cold heart of the earth. This was not a primitive hole. It was a 270-foot concrete artery pulsing with high-voltage electricity and climate-controlled air. Behind this subterranean masterpiece stood a 33-year-old visionary named Joaquin Guzman, a man who understood that binary chains of logistics beat walls. To protect this engineering marvel, the Syndicate executed 14 laborers, burying their secrets in shallow graves to ensure the silence of the dead. The United States declared victory by filling the exit with concrete, but they had actually witnessed the birth of a terrifying concept. Since that day, over 180 tunnels have bypassed the border. Yet not a single one was found by technology. Every discovery was the result of human betrayal or pure luck, proving that the most advanced nation on Earth is effectively blind. While we monitor the surface with drones and sensors, a silent army of architects is carving a new world beneath our boots. The asymmetric war had moved from the visible horizon into the crushing weight of the geological deep, where silence is the currency. How do you fight an enemy that has already solved the mathematical problems of air pressure, structural load, and total invisibility? Welcome to the era of the Super-Tunnel, where the surface is merely a distraction for the genius of the criminal underworld. Across the border in Douglas, Arizona, federal agents step into a cavernous warehouse large enough to park 6 semi-trucks. Near the back, they spot what looks like an ordinary drainage grate. When they pry it open, a gust of stale air hits their faces. Inside compartments carved into the tunnel walls, agents find recessed storage bays large enough to stash 5 tons of cocaine at a time. Overhead, a jury-rigged ventilation system pipes in fresh desert air through PVC tubes to keep the temperature at 65 degrees. One tunnel ran 2,200 feet with reinforced concrete walls and a rail cart system ending in the kitchen of a Tijuana home. They kept laser pointers strung down the passage to ensure they stayed on course while chewing through rock at 5 feet per day. Federal law now explicitly bans the construction of illicit tunnels, threatening prison sentences of up to 20 years for anyone caught digging. The new 30-foot-tall steel border fence deterred crude gopher hole tunnels, but it was no match for a 6-story deep passage. Somewhere out there, even now, another crew is likely digging in silence deep underground, while the border wall stands tall in the sun. The Syndicate did not hire common criminals to build these. They recruited professional civil engineers who understood structural physics and geology. Choosing the right soil was the first critical step, as Otay Mesa's clay-rich earth allowed for stable tunnels without immediate collapse. To evade the high-tech seismic sensors of the Border Patrol, the Syndicate mandated the use of manual tools over heavy machinery. They utilized treated timber and reinforced concrete, ensuring the passage could withstand the pressure of 70 feet of earth pressing down. Sophisticated laser alignment tools were used to ensure the tunnel remained on a precise course, preventing any accidental surface breakthroughs or deviations. The Syndicate specialized in the ghost warehouse strategy, maintaining the appearance of a legitimate shipping business while digging beneath the floor. Disposing of tons of dirt was the biggest risk, so they used a fleet of ordinary vans to move earth unnoticed. Oxygen levels were managed through complex ventilation systems that scrubbed the air of dust and carbon dioxide for the workers below. They illegally tapped into the city's power grid, siphoning electricity to run the lights, pumps, and elevators without alerting utility companies. Groundwater was a constant threat at 70 feet down, requiring a network of automated sump pumps to prevent the passage from flooding. A hardwired telephone system provided a secure, unhackable hotline between the Mexican entrance and the U.S. exit for real-time coordination. The transition from surface to tunnel was handled by industrial-grade elevators capable of moving multi-ton loads of cargo in seconds. Motorized rail carts allowed for the silent and rapid movement of product, turning a half-mile journey into a few minutes of transit. Every few hundred feet, recessed storage bays were carved into the walls, allowing the Syndicate to stockpile tons of product mid-transit. The final breakthrough required extreme precision. A few inches of error could mean surfacing in the middle of a street instead of a warehouse. While digging below, they monitored the surface with hidden cameras, watching for any sign of federal interest or unusual activity. The workers, often coerced or trapped by debt, lived in these dark passages for weeks at a time to maintain total secrecy. When federal engineers finally inspected the busts, they were shocked to find standards that rivaled legitimate public infrastructure projects. The use of false walls and hidden rooms within the warehouses ensured that even a casual inspection would reveal nothing out of the ordinary. By timing their most intensive digging with the noise of surface construction, the Syndicate masked the vibrations from seismic detection arrays. They even accounted for thermal imaging, using specialized insulation to keep the tunnel's internal heat from being detected by overhead drones. From a business perspective, the methodology was flawless. A $2 million investment could be recouped in a single successful night of operation. This was the ultimate asymmetric victory. Low-tech, ancient digging methods successfully defeating the most advanced surveillance technology on the planet. As the years passed, the methodology evolved from crude wooden shoring to permanent steel and concrete structures designed for long-term use. The Syndicate methodology was a masterclass in hidden infrastructure, proving that with enough money and expertise, any border can be bypassed. What we have discovered is likely only a fraction of the total network, a testament to the enduring success of their methodology. The engineering is finished, the path is clear, and the shadow war continues to rage beneath the feet of an unsuspecting nation. The tunnels transformed from desperate dirt paths into multi-million-dollar arteries, pumping pure profit directly into the Syndicate's growing empire. Smuggling was no longer a street-level hustle. It became a high-stakes corporate enterprise managed with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. In 2010, agents in Otay Mesa uncovered two massive passages, seizing 50 tons of marijuana in one of the largest busts ever recorded. One tunnel ended abruptly inside a residential kitchen in Tijuana, hidden beneath a tiled floor that moved silently on precision-engineered rollers and tracks. Another route emerged inside a bustling San Diego produce warehouse, where drugs were disguised as innocent shipments of avocados and tropical fruits. By 2011, the Syndicate began adding luxury touches, including wood-paneled floors and climate control systems that rivaled the finest office buildings above ground. The James Bond gadgets evolved from simple water spigots to complex remote-controlled hydraulic systems that could seal an entrance in under 5 seconds. Guzman earned the nickname El Rapido because his tunnels allowed cocaine to cross the border faster than the legal shipments at official ports. In just 7 months, a single sophisticated tunnel moved 30 tons of cocaine, worth hundreds of millions of dollars on the streets of America. Ironically, as the United States built taller walls and deployed more drones, they inadvertently subsidized the Syndicate's move into deeper, more expensive tunnels. The clay-rich soil of Otay Mesa provided the perfect medium. It was firm enough to prevent cave-ins but soft enough for manual excavation. The ghost warehouse strategy involved renting unremarkable industrial spaces, using legitimate business fronts to mask the sounds of heavy machinery and constant digging. Constant truck traffic provided the perfect acoustic camouflage, masking the vibrations of jackhammers and the removal of thousands of tons of excavated earth. The Syndicate didn't just use laborers. They recruited skilled miners and engineers, paying them top dollar to design structures that defied standard detection. Crews worked in relentless 12-hour shifts, eating and sleeping in the subterranean darkness to minimize the risk of being seen on the surface. When security patterns changed above ground, the builders simply abandoned their current path, sandbagging the old route and burrowing in a completely new direction. In dense urban areas like Tijuana, the ambient noise of city life creates a wall of static that renders most seismic sensors completely useless. Modern tunnel task forces, known as tunnel rats, now use fiber optic cameras and portable robots to probe the earth for hidden voids and shafts. The Department of Homeland Security is testing experimental quantum gravity sensors that detect minute density variations in the ground, searching for hollow smuggling paths. Sealing these passages is an expensive game of whack-a-mole, with the government spending millions of dollars to plug holes that cost far less to dig. The fundamental asymmetry is staggering. The United States must defend 2,000 miles of border while the Syndicate only needs to succeed in one. One raided tunnel featured a dedicated hardwired phone line, providing a secure, unhackable communication link between the safe houses on both sides of the border. These tunnels are more than just smuggling routes. They represent a direct affront to national sovereignty, proving that no barrier is truly impenetrable. History shows that static defenses like the Great Wall or the Maginot Line have always been bypassed by those with enough time and motivation. We must stop viewing the border as a simple line on a map and start seeing it as a complex, three-dimensional battleground of depth. As long as the massive demand for narcotics persists, the Syndicate will continue to find ingenious ways to move their product through the earth. While the border wall stands tall in the desert sun, the earth below remains full of secrets, patiently and relentlessly inching their way northward. Ground-penetrating radar was supposed to be the ultimate solution, yet it fails to penetrate the deep, dense layers of the border. The soil is a mess of caliche, clay, and rock, creating geological noise that renders our most advanced sensors completely ineffective. When the Syndicate digs 70 feet down, the radar signals simply die in the earth before they can ever reach the ceiling. In the urban chaos of Tijuana, the constant roar of industrial traffic masks the faint, rhythmic thumping of a clandestine digging operation. Decades ago, we sent human tunnel rats into the Kuchai tunnels because technology was just as blind then as it is now. Every major tunnel discovery was the result of human intelligence, betrayal, or pure luck, rather than any high-tech wonder gadget. The San Diego Tunnel Task Force began watching for the smallest clues. Like dirt being hauled away in the dead of night, agents started knocking on doors, chatting with landlords about warehouses that were rented but never seemed to move any actual merchandise. In Nogales, the cartels began tapping directly into the city's vast drainage canals, allowing them to surface inside the United States undetected. Raids uncovered professional engineering blueprints, proving that these were not amateur holes but multi-million-dollar subterranean construction projects. The addition of motorized elevators allowed the Syndicate to move tons of narcotics from the deep tunnels to the surface in minutes. A dedicated hardwired telephone system provided a secure line of communication that could not be intercepted by traditional border surveillance technology. From a business perspective, losing 10 tunnels is an acceptable loss when the 11th moves $50 million worth of product. By hardening the surface with 30-foot walls, the United States inadvertently forced the cartels to perfect their subterranean infiltration strategies. The engineering evolved from primitive dirt holes into robust highways reinforced with steel, capable of withstanding the weight of the border. Groundwater was a constant threat, requiring complex drainage systems and industrial pumps to keep the multi-million-dollar cargo from being ruined. The ghost warehouse strategy allowed for the seamless transition of drugs from the tunnel directly into legitimate commercial supply chains. Despite our best efforts, the most advanced seismic arrays often show nothing while a tunnel is being carved just yards away. By 2020, the Syndicate had finalized its most audacious project yet. A tunnel stretching nearly a mile with unprecedented technical sophistication. The entry points were disguised within unremarkable industrial buildings, featuring motorized lifts capable of lowering heavy pallets of cargo into the depths. Extensive ventilation systems ensured that workers could operate for 12-hour shifts at depths where oxygen would otherwise become dangerously thin. The exit points were often located city blocks away from the border, popping up in unsuspecting storefronts or quiet industrial basements. When mapped, the passage revealed a complex, winding route designed to avoid the foundations of existing buildings and surface security cameras. Builders were forced to improvise in real time, sealing off branches that became unviable and burrowing further to find a safer exit. The tunnel boom forced Congress to act, passing new laws that explicitly ban the construction of illicit passages under the border. Sealing these passages is a costly game of whack-a-mole, as the syndicate simply starts digging the next one before the concrete dries. The tunnels are now a permanent part of the landscape, a testament to the relentless demand that fuels this subterranean arms race. The 2006 Border Tunnel Prevention Act finally criminalized the act of digging, imposing 20-year prison sentences for those caught constructing these passages. Specialized ICE units now train in simulated oxygen-deprived environments to prepare for the lethal hazards of unventilated deep earth smuggling passages. Experimental quantum gravity gradometers are being tested to detect subtle density variations in the Earth that might indicate hidden subterranean voids. Beneath the engineering marvel lies a dark reality of forced labor, where workers are held at gunpoint to dig until they collapse. Historical precedents like the Maginot Line prove that static defenses are eventually bypassed by those with enough determination and financial resources. The border is no longer a simple line on a map. It has become a complex three-dimensional volume of constant infiltration. While the sun-scorched steel wall stands as a symbol of security, the real war is being fought in the silent darkness. The Syndicate understands that defense must be perfect everywhere, while an attacker only needs to find a single vulnerable underground gap. As long as the massive demand for narcotics persists, human ingenuity will continue to carve new paths through the deep earth. The legacy of the 1990 discovery is a humbling reminder that the most advanced technology cannot fully secure the subterranean frontier. Today, the cat-and-mouse game continues as new tunnels are discovered, each deeper and more sophisticated than the last one found. The Earth remains full of secrets, with crews likely digging in total silence even as the surface world remains completely unaware. We must accept that perfection in border security is impossible as long as the economic incentives for smuggling remain so high. This subterranean industry is now a permanent fixture of the landscape, a testament to the lengths people go for profit. The engineering is finished, the path is clear, and the game of shadows continues beneath the feet of an unsuspecting nation. The legal battleground has shifted, but the physical reality of the tunnels remains a challenge that transcends mere words on paper. Intelligence-led policing has become the primary weapon, as technology continues to struggle against the simple, ancient art of digging deep. The Syndicate's engineering is a masterclass in adaptation, turning every surface-level security upgrade into a reason to dig even deeper. With profit margins reaching into the thousands of %, the cost of building even the most complex tunnel is negligible. The geological complexity of the border remains the Syndicate's greatest ally, providing a natural shield against the most advanced sensors. Existing infrastructure like drainage canals and sewer systems are regularly hijacked to provide ready-made paths into the heart of American cities. New experimental sensors are being developed to detect the faint gravitational signature of these hollow spaces deep within the Earth. Every warehouse in the border district is a potential entry point, hidden in plain sight among the legitimate commerce of the nation. The human cost of these tunnels is often forgotten, as workers are treated as disposable tools in the Syndicate's grand design. Despite millions spent on seismic arrays, the cartels have learned to mask their digging noise with the ambient roar of the city. History shows that walls are only as strong as the people guarding them, and corruption remains a constant threat to any barrier. By hardening the surface with 30-foot walls, the United States has inadvertently subsidized the Syndicate's move into the subterranean realm. The engineering is finished, the path is clear, and the game of shadows continues beneath the feet of an unsuspecting nation. The tunnels are now a permanent part of the landscape, fueled by a relentless demand that no wall can ever fully stop. Somewhere out there, even now, another crew is likely digging in silence, deep underground, waiting for their moment to surface.